So, I've got a couple of poems for us to take a look at. I have talked to you about many steps that we can take as students trying to learn about poetry to get through something that seems pretty challenging. And there's no doubt about it. Poetry is challenging. At least for me, it's challenging. I'm assuming because you're young and you haven't done as many poems as most people have, it's probably going to be challenging for you too. So I'm going to bring up that list again to remind you of the many steps that you can take to help yourself through a poem. And if you'll notice, I have come up with two poems that have the exact same title, but if you're looking closely here and here, I've got two different poets. So it'll be interesting to see what they each have to say about a spring storm. But let me get my list up first. Let's see. Get revenge on the people who made me make poetry videos. Learn to spell better. Nope, that's not the one I meant. You'll have to excuse that. That's another note for something else. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, right here. These are the things that we need to do if we're going to better understand poems as they come across our desk or our screen. I've got, I think, 9 things listed out here. First one, of course, is to read the poem out loud. The whole point of poetry is it's supposed to be read out loud. I will do that. If I'm really confused on my first pass, I can go back and reread it a second time. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, when I read it the first time, it's probably going to be kind of clunky. I haven't really practiced these, but that's kind of natural. If you haven't read it for the first time, you're going to be a little clunky when you read it too. You need to try to think about the poem type, of course. Do I recognize this poem? Is it a shape poem? Is it a sonnet? Is it maybe a haiku, gesundheit? What kind of poem is it? If you know the type, sometimes that helps you unlock a lot about it. It's kind of like, think about a genre in just a regular book. If you're reading something and you recognize it as a mystery book, you know that when you're reading, there's going to be some type of mystery, obviously. There might be this thing called a red herring. There are going to be people who are suspects. There are people going to have alibis. Knowing genre type, and in this case, poem type, is a big help. You're going to think on the title. I will certainly do that. I'm going to try to identify who's speaking in a poem and then what the subject is of the poem, which it seems pretty obvious to me. It's about a spring storm. But then again, I won't know till I read it. I'm going to look for any allusions and historical references. Man, those are 2 hard ones. You have to know some history to recognize it. But if you see something that looks historical to you, you should look it up unless you already know a lot about it. And then allusion is something we don't talk a lot about, but a lot of poems will sneak in things from other poems or from other books. Like the Bible gets a lot of things borrowed from it and snuck into a poem, or mythology will often sneak it into a poem. So you got to be on the lookout for that because it often helps to unlock meaning. We're going to look at our figurative language, of course, the little tools that an author or poet uses to make something come alive. We're going to look for tone and mood, which can also be a great way to help ourselves understand what we're reading. And then, of course, we're going to try to see if there's some type of message to the poem. So I'm going to read them both aloud, back to back, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to pull up the same version of the poems in which I've annotated them. It's going to be a little messy because I'm doing a think aloud here. I'm just giving you my thoughts as they come to me. But that's kind of how we do things. Here we go. Spring storm. He comes gusting out of the house, the screen door a thunderclap behind him. He moves like a black cloud over the lawn and stops. A hand in his mind grabs a purple crayon of anger and messes the clean sky. He sits on the steps, his eyes drawing a mustache on the face in the tree. As his weather clears, his rage dripping away, wisecracks and wonderment spring up like dandelions. Okay. Spring Storm by William Carlos Williams. The sky has given over its bitterness. Out of the dark change all day long, rain falls and falls, as if it would never end. Still the snow keeps its hold on the ground, but water from 1,000 runnels. It collects swiftly, dappled with black, cuts a way for itself through the green ice in the gutters. Drop after drop it falls from the withered grass stems over the overhanging embankment. Okay, well, I can check this off. I read the poem out loud. I'm not going to reread it, at least not right here and now. I definitely get a different flavor from these poems, and yet at the same time, I'm getting the same feeling. So I'm completely confused. Let me pull up the ones that I've worked on, which, by the way, I'm going to let you kids in on a little secret here. You go to school to become a teacher, and they make you do all these lessons, and you have to show you can do all kinds of stuff. And then they just give you a monster book, and it contains the answer to every single question on the planet. It's true. I'm going to pull it up right now. You'll see. Let me do the Jim Wayne Miller one all the way on the left. Okay, so Spring Storm for him. Let me keep my list here. I may not be able to do that. I know. Okay, here we go. So first thing I did is I'm going to take a look at the poem, right? I'm going to look at the poem type. Sorry, that's next on my list. I'm going to check it off right now for myself. Like, I don't recognize this as any type of poem. It's not a shape poem. It's not a sonnet. I kind of know what those are. It's definitely not a haiku because it's not short enough. So I don't recognize it. I'm skipping that. I'm going to look at the title and I'm going to think about it. Spring Storm. I know what a spring storm is. It's a storm that happens in the spring. And I know that sounds obvious. But the thing about a spring storm, as I recall, is that they come kind of quickly and then they sort of disappear as quickly. You know, if you've ever been to Florida, you could be walking along on a beautiful day, 85 degrees, and then suddenly a rainstorm will start and it'll be heavy for like 10 minutes and then it'll just kind of vanish and then it's really muggy. But that's a spring storm for you. I'm going to check that off. Boom. All right. Now I have to identify the subject and the speaker. Well, the subject is about a spring storm, but I'm also, noticing that it's about a kid here or a person of some type, a he. All right. So, because I see he over and over and over. So I don't know who he is or exactly how old he is, but I have that sort of idea that it's a boy. And this is one of the things about a lot of poems. They never tell you exactly who the subject is in a poem. It's just a generic person of a generic age or a generic background. I did one analysis of another poem by Langston Hughes, and in that one, my feeling was it was probably a black male who was talking based on the way the poem went. Was it a specific black male? No. Is it the poet? Probably not. They usually don't put themselves in their poems. But it's kind of like all black people and how they felt at that time period. So here again, I just have a generic guy. All right, let's do the next one. Notice allusions and historical references. No allusions here that I can see. No other books being mentioned. No other things about mythology or the Bible or movies or anything. So I could skip that. Historical references, same. Figurative language. Okay, now this is the deal. It's poetry. It basically has to have this stuff. It's almost impossible, I think, to write a poem without it. So the big thing, of course, we know about this is we're trying to make something come alive and be very picturesque for us so we can see it in our head. So I'm going to look for my examples of figurative language. He comes gusting out of the house. Oh, that one's different. Sorry, right here. I noticed that he moves like a black cloud is, of course, a simile. Uses the word like to compare this he, whoever he is, to a black cloud. It doesn't sound very good. And then I noticed it also picks up on the stanza before, when the screen door slammed with a thunderclap of sound. I've put in red a bunch of words that kind of seem to connect with a storm. Gusting, thunderclap, black cloud, purple, anger, because we sometimes say like, oh, look at those purple clouds rolling in, dripping, all right? So the author is creating this whole collection of related words. We can call this good word choice. They're not really amazing words. They're not super descriptive, but they're all related to each other in the sense that they hint back at the title of a spring storm. Okay, let's see here. What else do I have? Personification. He sits on the steps, his eye drawing a mustache on the face of the tree. Well, your eyes can't draw anything. That's not what their job is. So somebody has personified it, making the eye create a drawing. And then it says, let's see. What a strange line. It was weird. As his weather clears, that was confusing to me. Like, how does his weather clear? He's a person, not a type of element. So I wasn't sure about that one. That one struck me as a little weird. And I thought, what if I replaced this with, as his mood clears, his rage dripping away? That kind of made sense to me. What else do I have? Down at the bottom, you got a whole bunch of stuff. You have alliteration, wisecracks, and wonderment. We have the W sound being repeated. And we have a simile, of course. His rage dripping away, wisecracks and wonderment spring up like dandelions. His sense of awe and excitement pop up like a bright dandelion. So I've got a list of different figurative language going, and now I'm getting it clued into a lot of things here. There's an idea of a storm being drawn out, but it ends with these dandelions. Okay? So I know something's going on with the kid in the storm. There's some relationship there. What I'm also realizing, and this is not as maybe obvious, but the entire poem is kind of like a long metaphor. The kid is being compared to a spring storm. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that by going back to the beginning. He comes gusting out of the house. The screen door, a thunderclap behind him. Think about that. He comes gusting out, the wind gusts. So he's acting like a gust of wind. When he lets the screen door go, it thunderclaps behind him. That's a nice effect. I can visualize that. That wooden door that slams against the frame loud and hard. Okay? So like a storm zipping by or slamming a door. And then it continues. He moves like a black cloud over the lawn. So he's like the storm going over the lawn, and then he stops suddenly. And the mind in his hand grabs a purple crayon of anger and messes the clean sky. Now, this is where I really got the idea that this was a kid. And I'll tell you why. He stops, this kid, I'm imagining, and he suddenly grabs a purple crayon. Like, I mean, usually if you're older, you're not using a crayon anymore, okay? You've switched over to pencils and pens and, other better writing instruments. A crayon is for kids. So I could see a kid storming out of a house in anger, stopping, and then he's kind of like going, argh. He's like crossing out the world in front of him. Now he's doing this in his head, but he's really angry. It says he sits on the steps, his eyes drawing a mustache on the face in the tree. Okay? Kind of weird, but I could see a kid doing that, trying to scribble something onto a tree in his head. As the weather clears, his rage stripping away. So the metaphor here is the storm came really strong and fierce and nasty, and then it moves away. And when that goes away, so does his mood. He's getting over his situation. And suddenly, after he's drawn something silly in a tree in his head, this sense of wisecracks and wonderment spring up in his head like dandelions. He's very excited and happy. So when I look at this, and I go on to my next check, by the way, tone, I think this is an angry kid until the end. Okay? And the mood is reflected by the weather. And I'm going to go to figuring out the poem message. Well, here's what I'm figuring out. I wrote down what happened. So you have to kind of just get the gist. The gist is, I think a kid bursts out of his house in anger. He throws a bit of a fit. Nice, see a little rhyme? I'm a poet too. And then changes his mood as quickly, laughing at how he marked up the tree. Now, is there a clear message here about life? I don't know, but I came up with this. Children, like spring storms, can go from angry to happy in a second. And that's true. If you've observed a child, they can throw a tantrum 1 second and then they can go back to being playful and happy just like that. They let things go very quickly. So, Spring Storm, an incredibly clever poem in which a kid's anger, which comes like a rage and then goes away as quickly, mirrors a spring storm because that's what spring storms do. Now, type of poem? Nope, don't have that. Deep message? Not really. What is the poet doing here? He just observed something about how kids can behave, and he thought, it's funny because there's something in nature that behaves similarly, and he wrote this brilliant little piece to reflect the two together. Extended metaphor. Awesome. Let's get on to our next one. So the William Carlos Williams poem here, also titled Spring Storm, and I'm going to pull back up my checklist and I'm going to do them in reverse. They're all checked now, but I'm going to uncheck them as I get through them. Now, what do we have here? I'm going to be honest, this one is more complicated by far, and that's okay. First thing I had to do was read the poem out loud. I did that, and I'm going to reread it right now for you just so it's fresh in our heads. Spring Storm by William Carlos Williams. The sky has given over its bitterness. Out of the dark change, all day long, rain falls and falls as if it would never end. Still, the snow keeps its hold on the ground. But water from 1,000 runnels, it collects swiftly, dappled with black, cuts a way for itself through the green ice in the gutters. Drop after drop, it falls from the withered grass stems of the overhanging embankment. All right, let me get into this. Step number 1, I read it, and I actually reread it, so good for me. Check the poem type. I suspect I know what the type is of poem here, and I'm actually going to tell you just to get it out of the way. This is a poem of imagery. And I say that because the poet has picked some strong words here. The poet has definitely captured a very singular experience, something that they've seen, something we've probably all seen, especially recently. So I'm going to explain why it's imagery in a minute, because I definitely have a sharp image in my head. I mean, that's really the reason here. But I'll go through that in a few seconds when I'm talking about other parts of it. Think of the title, Spring Storm. Is it the same kind of spring storm in the last poem? No. I don't have a kid in here. I just have a poet and a narrator who are observing something about a spring storm and the effect it's having on the land. I do not have any other thing with a kid in here. So they're not really related that way. But it is certainly about a spring storm. In fact, it's closer to spring storm than the other poem, which was really about the kid's mood. I know that sounds weird, but it's accurate. Next, I'm going to identify the subject and the speaker. I kind of already did that. There's no real speaker. Somebody has maybe passed by and they're noticing something, but that's not the point of this. And then the subject, of course, is the spring storm. I covered that. Notice any allusions and historical references. I don't believe either are here. I don't see allusions to other written works, and I don't see any historical references. Find figurative language. Well, we have that. As I told you, it's almost impossible to write a poem without it. So let's go through that. Right here. The sky has given over its bitterness. What an awesome line. And I'll say that because the sky can't be bitter. So that means it's an example of personification. The sky has been turned into a person. Only people can be bitter, right? Only people have emotions like that. So the sky has given over its bitterness is a great example of personification. And I like the line because it gives me a strong feeling about what the sky is doing. It continues on, out of the dark change all day long, rain falls and falls, which leads to our next figurative language example, alliteration. We have the F sound being repeated here. Now, yes, granted, the word is being repeated, but it counts. It's an effect that the poet's going for, and he repeats this a little later by repeating a few words here and there, and we'll talk about why he does that in a minute. Still, the snow keeps its hold on the ground. Technically, I would say that this counts as alliteration. Still, the snow, you get that S sound within a couple of words of each other, and that's something else you want to keep in mind. Alliteration doesn't have to always be one word right next to the two words don't have to follow each other with the same sound. They can. It's usually more effective, I think. But once in a while, if they're spread out a couple words here and there, it still can work for the proper effect. All right, what other examples of figurative language do we have? Alliteration, again, as I said before, we have cuts a way for itself through the green ice in the gutters, okay? You get a repetition here of sounds. And then we have, no, that's not what I was talking about. Good, okay. So let me get back to the imagery being developed here. Figurative language. All right, this is a hard poem. It's not meant to be easy for you. It certainly was difficult for me, but I'm going to go through it line by line and try to tell you or show you what it is that I'm imagining. The sky is given over its bitterness. So the sky has either given into bitterness or given up on being bitter. Like, in other words, maybe it's not as dark as it was before, or it's giving into darkness. It's the next sentence that clarifies that for me. Out of the dark change all day long, rain falls and falls as if it would never end. It's pouring rain. I mean, just coming down in buckets, falls and falls. But still the snow keeps its hold on the ground. Now I can picture that. You know when the snow gets packed down by water, gets kind of crunchy, icy almost, but it's not disappearing. Even though it's pouring rain, there's still a blanket of snow there. But water from 1,000 runnels, another cool line. He repeats water. He's going for the alliteration, of course. But the cool word here is runnels. And I don't really know what that means. And I just kind of did a say what? I think a runnel is a cheat. I think it's either, it could be a real word. I'm sure I could look it up. Anyone could look it up. But it sounds like it's a combination of the word tunnels and running. And think about that. When snow does sort of break down eventually and lets water course through it or race through it, it sets up these little tunnels through it. And where there's a shelf of ice just above it, but you see the little water kind of snaking its way through, it's like a little tunnel of water going through the ice pack. which is kind of a nice effect. It collects swiftly, it's moving fast. Dappled with black, cuts away for itself through the green ice in the gutters. So as it works its way down through the snow, I'm visualizing that it's getting down to little dirt patches for the black, or it's just becoming a dark line in the snow as it kind of branches out like snake-like through everything. And then little by little, you're spotting the grass beneath it finally. Drop after drop, it falls from the withered grass stems of the overhanging embankment. Sounds like the storm has died off maybe, because drop by drop, it's coming off these withered, sort of, dead yellow grass blades into an embankment, which is a waterway of some kind, a stream or something. Okay. Does a lot happen in this poem? No, but here's what I came up with. There's a strong storm that pours a lot of rain onto a snow-covered ground. It creates all these tunnels in the snow and works its way down enough to reveal the winter grass before collecting in some waterway. That's it. Nothing big happens. But that's an example of imagery. You're capturing one small episode in time often and putting a person right there with you. The message, I said it's hard to tell, but imagery isn't really about a story message. Like I said, this is closer to like photographing something, but only using words. I could take a picture and show you something, but you're not there with the picture. You're not feeling it. A poet tries to put you there, not just visually see it, but also to experience it and have an idea of, how that must have felt at that moment, the smells and scents and things like that. Poet didn't do it here, but he certainly created some very strong visuals. All right, so tone, for the most part, the tone and mood is pretty even. I mean, I think the person's excited about this. There is an exclamation point in there. It's kind of covered with runnels, but there is one there. And I think the idea is to sort of capture how quick and immediate everything hit and melted away the snow. Figure out poem message, mission accomplished there. Of course, there's probably real poets out there who are going to write me some nasty emails and say, you completely missed it, dude. That's okay. I'm fine with that. I'll live with my understanding of the poem because I tried as hard as I could to work my way through it. So always remember, you can do this too. You can read a poem out loud. You can reread it. You can check for a type of poem. You'll get familiar with types of poem after a while. You're always going to think about the title. The title's usually a clue to what's going on. At the very least, it gives you the subject often. You're going to try to look for those historical references and actually look them up, please, or ask mom and dad. Or if you got a really smart dog, ask your dog, okay? Figurative language, that's clicking now. I believe it's clicking in your head, similes and metaphors and alliteration and assonance, and all that other stuff, okay? Be on the lookout because it's a powerful tool. Remember the other poem. It was one long metaphor. And it was a well-done metaphor about a kid who's angry and he gets over his anger quickly, just like a spring storm comes in fast and hard and then disappears. Try to figure out tone and mood when you can, and then figure out any messages a poem might have. We're going to look at some poems eventually that do have some messages to them. These really not so much. That's all I got to say. I got to go work on getting my revenge on people and learning to spell better.